there has been an enormous religious collapse in the world today, especially in the last decade. And I just wanted to give a few statistics about that, because there's nobody on a crusade against the churches. There's nobody trying to down anybody here. There was a great nervousness in Cape Town, we understood, about people, especially from America, coming to tell them what to do. There was a big television program on that topic the day before we spoke. So obviously, as we had come from America and were probably going to be telling people what they might do, we were a bit nervous. Anyway, we tried to avoid that as far as possible. But I was trying to use at the start the statistics from Europe, which are the only ones that I conveniently have, about the collapse of religion. And I started off that talk by saying that the ancient Chinese had a saying, "May you live in interesting times." It was usually intended as a curse. And there's no doubt that the churches, all of the churches, have been living in very, very interesting times indeed for the past 10 or 20 years. Now, to take the examples, as I said, from Europe, my own native continent, which was once renowned as the cradle of Christianity. The Belgian sociologist Jan Kerkhoffs, a very famous man, pointed out that in Central and Eastern Europe, in the last year or two, 73% of the population profess no allegiance to any church or religious organization whatsoever. Now that is a very significant and new fact, which you don't find anything like that, of course, here in the United States, where by and large the majority of people profess some form of religious allegiance still. And all the signs in Europe are of a colossal drift away from all forms of organized religion. Samuel Huntington wrote a book about 2 or 3 years ago called The Clash of Civilizations, and he said that this drift was unusual in the sense that there was no hostility to the churches or religions whatsoever in this drift, which always accompanied smaller drifts of this kind in the past. But this time there was no hostility towards religion or towards the churches, but something much worse, indifference. And liberation from all forms of religion, but particularly from Christianity, was reaching proportions that had never before been attained in history in Europe at the moment. That's why Peter Berger, the Viennese-born American sociologist, called Europe at the moment a church catastrophe. That was a sentiment re-echoed in the Herald Tribune, which I quoted when it called Europe the most godless quarter on earth. It's not a godless quarter, of course. It's a religionless quarter, which is something very different indeed. And I just mentioned that in the city of Dublin in Ireland, which was famous up to very recently for the rate of religious practice, in the 90% somewhere, that in many parishes in Dublin now, the rate of religious practice is about 7%. And this has been a very dramatic collapse in recent years. Now, there is a revival, of course, of Christianity in some places too, in particular in parts of Africa, in Nigeria, for instance, and also in the East, in Korea. Dramatic rise in membership in church affiliation. But, of course, nobody really knows whether that will continue when the same sociological forces that impinge on Europe now begin to be experienced there as well. It probably will follow the same path. There's no lack of voices fastening onto these little isolated instances of religious revival. There's a French sociologist, Kepler, published a book a year or two ago called La Revanche de Dieu, God's Revenge. But the fact remains that the massive drift away from religion that's happening is undeniable, and the interest in spiritual things, which is a very prominent feature of the world today, this interest in spiritual things is taking place outside of the organized religions completely. And the point is that why do so many people, especially young people, find God so attractive and the church, which is supposed to be God's instrument, so dull and unappealing? What's wrong? Something has gone radically wrong there. Is it that the Christian churches don't read the signs of the times? Because I said, this is not an attack on any church, it's simply looking at the facts. And the facts are not being looked at. But is it that they don't understand the signs of the times, or is it that they do not want to understand the signs of the times? That's the problem. But whatever the reasons, the fact is that the church, which took its form at the time of the Emperor Constantine, that church is fading. And the second crossroads, every bit as crucial as faced religion in the 4th century, is now confronting all of the churches. Now, the responses of the churches have been very varied. Some have battened down the hatches. They have insisted on the rules all the more rigidly in a type of rigid fundamentalism. And others have tried to broaden their appeal by talking about issues of humanity and humanitarian causes, do-good society and so forth. And that was the sense of the joke about the janitor that I mentioned there, that the man was actually the Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. I didn't want to mention the building in Cape Town, where this ex-member said the last time the name of Jesus Christ was mentioned in that building was when the janitor fell down the back stairs. And we don't all have a back stairs. Well, I was saying that it was wonderful to see a gathering like the Parliament of World Religions, and I think as Pavel said, there was 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people there of all breeds and descriptions. It was wonderful to see a gathering like that and to try and learn from each other, because religions for so long have simply got into the bunkers and sniped across no man's land at each other. So it's wonderful to see a new cooperation. But however welcome that sort of development undoubtedly is, as I said there, it only amounts really to polishing the brass on a sinking Titanic. Because the issues behind the religious collapse going on today are far too deep and far too fundamental for any change in tactics to be able to remedy the situation. So as I said, this is not an attack. No one is attacking religion or attacking the churches. We're simply looking at facts that cannot be disputed. They're pointing to something very serious in how people perceive what the churches are doing, or what the religions are doing, and what they are failing to do. And we should try and ask exactly why this is happening. Now, the next point that I moved to in the talk was to look at the world views of Ptolemy, the Greek astronomer and mathematician, and Isaac Newton, names that you're well familiar with here. And it's important to look at those world views of those two people, because we really don't appreciate the degree to which religions have used those worldviews in spelling out what they believe in. I gave you here last year the example of what I call the hamburger universe, which we drew there. That was an old view of the world. The earth is a flat place with the heavens above, the underworld beneath. And obviously nobody, no scientist, for many centuries has ever believed that that's a true picture of the world and the cosmos. But still in religion, we keep that image at the back of our minds, and it colors the way we think. We look up when we pray to God, even though, as I said here, In North America, we're looking in one direction, and in South Africa, you're looking in exactly the opposite direction. But it's a hangover of the old cosmologies, which we never really advert to. Now, it's harmless to laugh about looking up to God and so forth, but there are much more serious issues lying behind it all that are really catastrophic for religion and that are also hangovers from the worldview of Ptolemy. Now, in primitive times, people observed that the sun, with great regularity, traversed the heavens every day, and the stars also seemed to revolve around the earth at a slightly different speed as the sun. Both stars and the sun and the moon seemed to revolve around the earth, but as people had no sensation whatsoever of the earth moving, it was concluded that it was the sun and the stars that were in rotation around us while the earth stood still. And in primitive times, it was imagined that the sun and the stars and the planets were fixed to spheres that revolved around the earth. They kept turning around the earth, and we stayed fixed in between. And sometimes it was alleged that there was friction between these spheres. They rubbed off one another as they passed, giving off a beautiful sound which people called the music of the spheres. And people who imagined themselves or believed themselves to be very sensitive claimed to be able to pick up this friction from the sphere's rotation. Anyway, the stars rotate around the earth every 23 hours and 56 minutes, the moon 24 hours and 50 minutes, and of course the sun in 24-hour period. So that model of what things are like in the cosmos served for a long time, until it was noticed that the planets didn't travel through the heavens as conveniently as if they were fixed to these spheres in a uniform rotation. Sometimes the planets seem to slow down, sometimes to stop, sometimes even to reverse their direction. So instead of this orderly movement, which being tied to a sphere would suggest that the Earth is here, and you have an orderly movement like this, you have something quite different. The planets, as I said, seem to slow down, seem to stop, seem to reverse their motion. Something like this. Then these miniature orbits were called epicycles. It's a very famous word. Epicycles. These are little subsidiary orbits on the big orbit, which tried to make the theory fit the facts better. But eventually, more epicycles had to be added onto the epicycles themselves. And you had, say, in the High Middle Ages, with Ptolemy's view of the spheres to which the planets and stars were fixed, you had to introduce all these little corrections, which produced a bizarre, complex arrangement. The King of Spain was alleged to have said, when some astronomer tried to explain Ptolemy's system with its epicycles and so forth, he said, if God Almighty had consulted me, I would have suggested a more simple arrangement. Now, what exactly happened were two things. I mean, I'm not going through this for the sake of talking about Newton and Ptolemy. There's a very important reason why we want to see what happened here. The ancient astronomers had unquestioningly assumed two things. First of all, that what appeared to the senses was in fact so. And the second presumption was they had an innate conviction of the innate superiority of the human race. Those were their two main assumptions. So the human race and the human race's home on this earth absolutely had to be at the center of everything. Otherwise, it was not appropriate. This is when truth becomes equated with geography. In other words, you can't be true, you can't be significant unless you're at the center of everything. It's the good address. Now, however awkward it became, they rigidly held on to those dogmas. And the attempt to fit the facts into those theories became more and more complex as time went on, as this example shows here. But nevertheless, the theory was rigidly adhered to. In other words, the bottom line is that we prefer by far to endlessly complicate matters so as to make the facts fit into the theory, rather than admit that a fundamental error has been made at the beginning. That is the fundamental issue behind the religious collapse today. I'll repeat it, that we prefer by far to endlessly complicate matters so as to fit the facts into the theory, rather than admit a catastrophic blunder was made at the start. And that's, of course, what Ptolemy's theory was. It was a blunder about the way the Earth and the planets and the sun related to each other. But people wouldn't accept that a blunder had been made. They simply complicated the theory endlessly. And that is exactly what religion has continued to do down the ages. So imagine the consternation in 1543, I think it was, when the Polish priest Nicholas Copernicus cut the Gordian knot and described the Earth simply as one of 7 planets orbiting around the sun. They only could see 7 at that time. Other people had suspected that that was the case, but they were too afraid of the reaction of the establishment to suggest that it could be so. Copernicus, of course, could not prove his theory, and his biggest problem was to explain how the sun and the moon and the planets keep moving, or how the sun is at the center and the planets and the subsidiary planets around the main planets, how they keep in motion without being pushed. That was his biggest problem. Mightn't seem like a problem to us today. That's probably because we haven't realized what the issue really is. And many people suggested all sorts of explanations for that. Some of the religious people who were trying to keep up with the science of the time suggested that angels pushed the heavenly bodies around and kept them on their courses. That mightn't be as remote and as abstract and irrelevant perhaps as it might seem. But in the 16th century, the famous Tycho Brahe recorded the movements of the planets, and his assistant was a man who eventually became very famous in his own right, Johannes Kepler. And Kepler had the genius to combine the insights of Copernicus with the measurements of his own master, Brahe, and the result were the famous laws known to every student, Kepler's laws, published in the 16th century. And Kepler's idea was that the planets orbited the sun not in a circular orbit, but in elliptical orbits, and that the speed depended on how far the planet was away from the sun. Now, of course, many scientists and almost all the theologians and the philosophers of those days regarded the views of Copernicus and Kepler as absolute rank heresy. However, of course, Kepler and Copernicus, despite the very radical nature of their views, which overturned a whole system of belief that had lasted more than 1,000 years in science, nevertheless, they lived safely in the abstract realms of mathematics, where they could be conveniently ignored by the establishment or ridiculed, whatever the occasion demanded. That was fine until along came an individual called Galileo Galilei, who was the PR man for the new views. He didn't make any revolutionary discoveries himself, but he was able to convey in a very understandable and attractive way what the findings of others had been. And worse still, Galileo actually had a little gadget an instrument through which even the most uneducated person could look and see evidence of this planetary movement. It was called something that saw at a distance, telescope in Greek, which every schoolboy, we used to say in Ireland, should know. So these popularized versions of Copernicus and Kepler is what did the damage. As I say, in themselves, they were abstract, living in ivory towers academically, and they could be siphoned off and kept safely removed until Galileo came along and presented them in a popular way, which excited the imagination of a great many people. As a result, Galileo was seen as a threat, and he was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. When he was made to recant his views that the earth moved around the sun rather than vice versa, it's said that when he got up off his knees from taking the oath, he said, "It still moves." Anyway, that brings us to the next stage, the clockwork universe, which has formed your education and mine without us knowing anything very consciously about that fact. But the clockwork universe is the universe we grew up in. It was the mentality that you and I were educated in, and it's still with us, very much alive and well. So Isaac Newton was born in England the day Galileo died. He couldn't wait to get back. And Newton observed that the earth exerted a force on everything near it and on all objects, and that the earth exerted a force on all other objects. So Newton combined Copernicus and Kepler and his own research and produced his famous laws of motion, which were published in 1687. And these laws have remained the foundations, of course, as you know, of classical mechanics to this day, and they describe observed phenomena, which you can see yourself, with great accuracy, even still today. But what is not so widely acknowledged is that it's also this procession of views from the time of Ptolemy down to Newton that have shaped and colored the ways in which the Western world thinks about God, about his relationship to the world, and our significance and presence in the world. That view is what lies at the background of the way religion thinks of God, and which makes it so hard, for instance, for us to grasp what the Ram is teaching. Because immediately he says the word God, we immediately think of a God fitting in to the world of Newton. That is our curse and our damnation. But it's ingrained into us. And as the Ram has said so often, the way you begin to eradicate those things is by knowledge, by realizing where these things came from and why, and then replacing them slowly and surely. So all of these cosmologies have been married uncritically into our fundamental religious beliefs. And that's where most of the present problems of religion today come from. So that what is the heart of belief and what is a scientific cosmology is no longer clearly separated. And most people don't even realize that what they're believing is in fact a scientific cosmology, not something to do with God and our relationship. That's why I'm spending some time talking about these views, because they have done so much to color the way we instinctively react and think about God and our place and our destiny. And the problem has always been that we also, like the scientist, try to fit and squash observed facts into outdated and inaccurate theories rather than admit the fundamental error has been made. Now, science has got over that hurdle. Religion has not got over that hurdle, because that's exactly where the problem of religions lie today. That's why you have that catastrophic collapse of religion all over Europe that I mentioned at the start, because the facts are still being squashed in to fit the theory. And that is why so many people find religion unattractive, why their lives remain humdrum, why so little of the extraordinary and the miraculous characterizes the religious traditions of today. And it's no great wonder that so many find nothing attractive in these traditions. And so many of the people who still remain in the churches, unfortunately, I think, do so not out of any great conviction about the truth of their traditions, but only because, like the famous French philosopher long ago, Blaise Pascal, they hang on not because of any great conviction, but because they consider it may be safer to believe rather than not to believe. The Ptolemaic Newtonian worldview can sustain the picture of a God who sent his only son to be a sacrifice to his own insatiable thirst for blood. That may seem strong language, but that's an accurate description of the way a great deal of Christians see the place of Jesus Christ in their faith, and no more. And you know from what the Ram has said, especially from the Gnostic scriptures which he's quoted from, that the teaching of Jesus is a far, far cry indeed from what people have reduced it to in this way. And it's the same God based on Newton's view of the world, that we look up to when we say that we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, which is merely an elaborate and disguised way of saying that we do not want to accept responsibility ourselves, but would like Jesus to do it for us, whatever the it is never specified, instead of making an effort to do it ourselves. And the worldview of Newton, on which so much religion has been hung, makes it easy to see salvation as some sort of an external reward tagged on to the end of our lives. We're put down here in the world as a sort of neutral testing ground, and God is up there scrutinizing us from above, exactly as Newton postulated, that the universe is like a gigantic clockwork machine, and God therefore is the clockmaker. He winds up the machine at the beginning. By and large, it runs along under its own steam. Occasionally, God may have to intervene when some particularly catastrophic malfunction occurs, usually as the result of human infidelity and sin. Everything is blamed on the infidelities of humanity against the goodness of their God. But this view of salvation then as a reward given to me for good behavior here when I die finds a very congenial home in the Newtonian worldview. Now, most people have never escaped from the mentality of childhood. The great French sociologist Émile Durkheim was one of the first to point out. And Carl Jung, whose thoughts are very close to what we learn here in this school, he said, and I quoted here, "Faith tries to retain a primitive mental condition on purely sentimental grounds. It's unwilling to give up the primitive childlike relationship to hypostasized figures. It wants to go on enjoying the security and the confidence of a world still presided over by powerful, responsible, and kindly parents." So just as in childhood, we always want to know that there is someone greater and more powerful who will take care of us and assure us that all will be well, so in adulthood, we still wallow in insecurity and long for somebody up there who will take care of us without asking us to do very much ourselves, except to keep that person up there in good humor. And that is the Achilles heel of the human race in religious terms. It's the same religious outlook that maintains we were born into this world in a state of enmity from God, and there's nothing we can do except throw ourselves on God's mercy. as the Protestants emphasize, or hope to attain through merit of a life of good works, as the Catholics maintain. Those views of things are really congenial to the worldview of Newton and Ptolemy. Another point that has bedeviled the religions is this absolute compulsion they seem to always exhibit, that theirs is the only true religion. Now, sometimes Catholicism is accused of that, but it's found in every religion. Mine is the true religion, and all other religions are not true. The trouble is that very often the truth of the particular faith is in question seems to be emphasized by the destruction of the competition. In other words, my church is true because all others are false, or my church is not true. So that's a sort of very illogical and odd way to proceed. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal last November that I came across, and it noted that 482 years exactly since Martin Luther nailed his famous 95 theses or objections to the church door at Wittenberg, it was reported that a commission of the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church, after 30 years of dialogue, had eventually reached an agreement on the most fundamental religious problem that has ever been, I suppose, exposed in history. That is the understanding of justification. Whether we find salvation by faith alone, or whether a lifetime of good works is an integral part of that. Now, it's great, obviously, to see such an agreement reached. And one can only applaud the dedication and the patience and the energy of the people who persevered long enough to bring this agreement to fruit. But I know myself, having indeed spent many a boring day trying to negotiate in situations like that, the amount of dedication and perseverance that it takes, sometimes it's not exactly best described as dedication. I think it's bovine contentment or something you have to cultivate. But it's good, as I say, to see such an agreement reached, and it is a milestone. But nevertheless, you can't help feeling a bit sad if you happen to, I don't get the Wall Street Journal, by the way, but if you were taking up your Wall Street Journal and reading this fact, it's hard not to feel sad that if agreement was possible to reach last November, how much better it would have been if that agreement could have been reached instead 500 years ago, which would have spared the disagreements that split Europe asunder in bitterness and hatred for centuries, and would have spared the lives of those countless thousands who perished in the 30 Years' War shortly afterwards, and in all the countless wars that have been inspired by religion since that time. How much better it would have been if an agreement that could be reached today could have been reached then instead. But you know, the factors that were different there, everyone was convinced that they had the truth and there could be no compromise. Now, it's easy to see with hindsight, of course, what might with profit have been done in the past. But even though we cannot roll back the pages of history, the question we must ask is, have we learned the lessons of history? Because as the old saying goes, people who do not learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. And the science today, unfortunately, is that we have not learned the lessons of history. Ignorance, as the Ram says, is forgivable. Error committed in knowledge is not. And the Lutheran Catholic agreement of last November has one major lesson to teach us all. And that is how dangerous, how long-lasting, how genocidal are the effects of believing that you have an exclusive franchise on the truth, and that only those who hold the franchise are on the right path and can attain their destiny. That trend is by no means confined to certain areas of Christianity. It's found in not far from the surface of most of the great religions, East and West. Then another factor that's very much at home in the worldview of Newton and Ptolemy are those deplorably bad images of our destiny which float in all religious people's minds today and which are still retailed from every pulpit in the world. Why are we here? Where are we going after death? What happens to us when we die? No church in this country or anywhere else has any sane answer to that question. And I've given you examples here before of how the fullness of our destiny, heaven or whatever you wish to call it, is sitting on a cloud, staring at God for all eternity, or playing a harp and so on, and all this garbage that goes under the guise of religion. Nowadays you hardly ever hear anything said about heaven in a church, and it's not because of the prevalence of janitors and backstairs. It's because they're embarrassed to retail this garbage anymore, because they know that people don't believe in it. But then there's nothing comes in its place either. So all you've left is a vacuum, and the old saying of Pascal, maybe it's safer to believe rather than not to believe, in case we'll be cut out when we die. Maybe there is a God there, maybe he'll punish us if we didn't believe. But there is a class of a believer as well, of course, who feels that even if we do believe in a loving God, that somehow the real issues are not being addressed unless somewhere we have a nice warm hell going at full blast. And the religions that don't go quite that far, nevertheless, keep a little touch of purgatory to prevent any tendency to backslide. But these feeble attempts to explain our destiny, our beatitude, or the opposite, result in a very materialistic understanding of the world. And it's the hamburger universe again, because reality is simply the earth, heaven above, hell below. Nothing more to it. No hint at all of what we know to be the case of the 7 levels of the creation that are mirrored in our own being here on earth. And that basically our purpose here in this world is to incorporate or to inhabit those 7 levels within us here so that we attain the corresponding destiny. In other words, it doesn't ever seem to have dawned on so many religious people, especially religious leaders whose responsibility it is, it's never dawned on them that they're living in a religious cloud cuckoo land. When you allow such images, such absolutely unworthy images, so close to the heart of what we believe or supposed to believe. And of course, theologians may fuss and cluck and say, oh, now, you know, heaven is not a place where you sit on a cloud, and we never said that, and it's not about harps and all this stuff. That's just the way the people believe in it. It's not really the official belief of the church. Well, then I would ask them, well, okay, so you say that's right, okay, I accept that. Well, then I say, has 2,000 years of preaching and religious instruction not been sufficient time to have replaced those erroneous images with something more adequate? What have you been doing all these years if the people are not believing what your faith actually is? Maybe there hasn't been enough time yet. But anyway, one little point I might add here is about belief in hell, because it is something that has really and continues to really plague the minds, especially of sensitive people in the world. The prospect of losing, as they say, your soul and going to hell to be burned for all eternity. We may laugh at that and cast it off, but for most people out there, I'm afraid, who are still in religious circles, it's not a laughing matter. But to believe that you can lose your destiny for all eternity on the basis of your performance in one single life has a lot of drastic implications. Obviously, it has something to say about the God we believe in. Is God all-loving if he can allow such a thing to happen? But there are far more catastrophic implications for that, and that's not news. People have been pointing this out for most of 2,000 years now, because if you do believe in a hell of everlasting torments, the major problem that's posed is, if God is omnipotent, which is the basic criterion for God, if you're interviewing somebody for the post of God, the first thing they would have to show is that they were omnipotent. They could do everything. If God is omnipotent, and still this renegade group of rebels persist and hold out against him, not just for a long time, but forever, what does that say about God's omnipotence? It takes the ground completely from under it. In other words, if you believe in a hell of everlasting torments, you are actually an atheist, because you have denied the reality of God. So hell is an atheistic belief, whereas most religious people feel that they're never more close to the truth of their religion than when they're thumping and shouting about it. They're atheists, if they would only realize it. Another great problem, of course, is the problem of evil. An innocent little child dies in terrible pain from cancer. The great example that the French novelist Albert Camus gave so often. If God is all loving and this sort of suffering happens, what's the conclusion to be drawn? So you have two options. You can either say that God is all powerful, or you can say that God is all loving. Power and love. These are the two great descriptions of God that we adhere to. But if the child is dying in terrible pain from cancer, what do we make of these two great descriptions? If God is all-powerful and he lets this happen, he cannot be loving. If, on the other hand, God is all-loving and the child is dying in terrible pain from cancer, he can't be able to do anything about it. He's powerless. So that situation, the countless problems of evil that are around us everywhere today, even look at the war in Bosnia or in Northern Ireland or Vietnam, wherever you want to do it, poses immense difficulties for the Newton view of God, for the religious view of God. And basically, the problem cannot be solved. Now, we know differently that the life that we have here is not, like the Buddhists and the Hindus maintain, a reward or a punishment for how we lived in our last lives. That's not true. What the circumstances of our lives here are pointers to what we need to own in order to evolve. They're not rewards or punishments. They're simply facing the lessons that we need to face in order to evolve. Obviously, these great problems like the child dying in terrible pain from cancer have a totally different aspect when you look at it in that light, but the problem is not soluble in terms of Christian belief. It is not soluble at all. It can't be solved at all. So one of the last things I'll mention on this line is the tendency to suppress the truth that has always existed. And that's one of the major problems which accounts for some of the worst difficulties that religion finds itself in today. The tendency to root out and suppress all information and questioning that does not support the status quo. And our history shows a pattern of the repression of truth rather than an openness to it. A tendency to always protect the institution rather than embrace the realities that the institution was supposed to be there for in the first place. Now, in the early days of Christianity, the teaching of Jesus and the apostles was something that was an inspiration to people. But when Christianity was confronted by the Roman Empire and paganism as they saw it, they had to begin to spell out and to formulate and systematize what they believed in. And that's when you had an institution appearing in religion, in the Christian religion. And all the apparatus that belongs to an institution appeared at the same time. Dogmas, creeds, rules and regulations. But freedom and the direct experience of the holy, or God, was frowned upon in religion because it was too hard to control. If you had your own independent access to the divine, what would be the need of a church? In the same way, the canon of the Bible was closed. The list of those books that were reckoned to belong to sacred scripture was closed. The books that belonged to the Old Testament were finalized at a meeting in Palestine, in Jamnia, a little town in Palestine, in the year 90 AD, the present layout of the Old Testament. The books that belong to the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, weren't fixed till around the year 400. And there were a lot of books that were excluded. Now, some of these were rightly excluded because they're very bizarre and so forth, but a lot of them that were excluded really ought not to have been excluded. And one in particular is one that's featured here a lot. The Gospel, for instance, of St. Mark is reckoned to be the oldest Gospel. And it was used by the writer of the Gospel of St. Matthew and the Gospel of St. Luke as a source. But for nearly 100 years, scholars of the Bible have suspected the existence of another source, which was used by Matthew and by Luke. And they've postulated what the outlines of that document must have been, because it no longer survived. Now, the Bible scholars have called this mysterious document the source, or in German, die Quelle, or simply have called it by the letter Q. It's called the document known as Q. Now, I would very strongly suspect that a document that has only come to light in our own time and was available in translation only in the late 70s is Q, and it's the Gospel of Thomas. It's as close to the postulations of what that source might have been like as can be. So I have no doubt whatsoever that the legendary Q is in fact the Gospel of Thomas. Now, what you find in the teaching of the three Thomas documents is that Jesus was two things. He was a teacher, and a teacher on two levels. One, the ordinary level, where Christians are told to love one another, be nice to one another, be honest, all these other things. And that, of course, provides for a nice, harmonious society. But you know that you can be nice to others and be just to others and so on and give them their rights while having an absolutely dastardly attitude. And all you engender in yourself is resentment and regret and anger and all the other qualities that so many Christians so obviously exhibit today. Hence the famous old saying, nearer to the church, farther from God. Now, there was also, as it's seen in the Thomas writing, a secret teaching as well. And it's there in that gospel and in the other two documents, which was confined to a smaller group. In other words, the net was thrown out to catch a large number of people, and then out of that number, a small group were selected who were ready to hear the secret teaching, as it was called, which is basically the teachings we're getting here from the Ram. But there was also a second level to the teaching of Jesus, which was that of a hierophant, that he initiated individuals into mysteries. You hear nothing whatsoever about that, of course, in the conventional picture of Jesus in Christianity, and you hear nothing about this teaching either, but it's there. And it's in those documents that I said have only been available to us for the last 25 years or so, but were known to exist from the beginning of Christianity. So this is where, when these books were kept out of the New Testament, that's when the beginning of the tradition of the suppression of truth began. Now, you know, a lot of people would say, oh, it's terrible that the Gospel of Thomas and the letter to the prefect of Thomas and the hymn of the Pearl of Thomas were not included in the New Testament. That's true. But in fact, if what I've suggested here is true, that the Gospel of Thomas is the legendary Q, then it's in a position superior to the New Testament. So it's not even on a par with it. It's a source of the New Testament itself. But that is where you have the contrast between the Jesus of Christianity and the true Jesus. The true Jesus was teaching the same teachings that we have here. The colossal difference between the two situations is that the 3 books of Thomas are only about 100 pages in total. And in comparison to that, we've had 22 years and 11,000 hours of teaching. So, if to whom much is given, much is expected is to hold true, we better look to our sources here. However, the perennial trend in human religion to suppress the truth, which began, I say in Christian terms, with establishing the list of what books were scripture and what were not, and keeping out the ones that might provide dangerous tendencies because of the suggestion that you could directly communicate with your God, not through an intermediary. That's the main reason why they were kept out. But that trend was expressed superbly in a 19th century novel, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And it's a sort of self-contained little parable in The Brothers Karamazov. It's called The Parable of the Grand Inquisitor. And the parable runs as follows, that at the beginning of the 16th century, Jesus returns to this earth. He returns, in fact, to Spain, in particular to the town of Seville. And despite the lack of any fanfare about his arrival, of course, people very quickly find him and realize who he is. And he goes about healing the sick, consoling people, teaching them, and instructing them. He's close to the Cathedral of Seville one day when a funeral comes along. And the mourners are carrying a little white coffin. It contains the body of a 7-year-old girl, the daughter, the only child, in fact, of one of the leaders of the city. And the mother takes the coffin and places it at the feet of Jesus and asks him to raise the child from the dead, which he does. Unfortunately, the miracle has been witnessed by a very prominent person, the Cardinal of Seville, who was also the Grand Inquisitor of the time. He was a 90-year-old ascetic, these are Dostoevsky's words, not mine, with a shriveled countenance. And such was the terror that he inspired in the people that despite the miracle of the raising from the dead, they parted and let him approach Jesus. And no one dared to interfere when the Inquisitor arrests Jesus and hauls him off to prison. But the real significance of the parable, of course, lies in what follows, because the reader surely expects that when the Grand Inquisitor conducts his investigation and finds out who his prisoner really is, that all will be well. No. The Grand Inquisitor wasn't horrified when he found out who his prisoner was, because when he came into his cell, it's all too obvious that he knew quite well who his prisoner was. And that did not deter him in the least. He remained adamant throughout all the philosophical and theological examinations that he put his prisoner through. Now, in the New Testament, you remember Jesus is tempted by the devil with the prospects of temporal power and fame and so forth and the success of his message. And now in this novel, 1600 years later, Jesus is put exactly to the same test by the Grand Inquisitor, who promises him his freedom and his liberty if he will deny what he is. But the Grand Inquisitor is under no delusions. He knew well what he was doing. He knew he carried the responsibility of upholding the status of a church founded in the name of the man he proposed to send to the stake, because that is what the Grand Inquisitor did. He condemned Jesus to be burned at the stake as a heretic. He knew that the church's teachings were not compatible with the teachings of the man in whose name that church was founded. The church had become autonomous, a law unto itself. Instead of giving to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, it had usurped Caesar and taken his place. And the Inquisitor sees that his duty is to uphold that regime. He knew full well that the rules and actions that come from him in his capacity as Inquisitor will undoubtedly result in what, in his own terms, would be described as his eternal damnation, the Inquisitor's eternal damnation. He knows, in short, that he has martyred himself to evil, and that in the temptation he offered to Jesus, he, the Inquisitor, has replaced the devil. He has become the devil, the very reality which his office was supposed to stamp out in the first place. That's another example of squashing the facts to fit the theory, which began, as I said, with the attempts to retain the cosmology of Ptolemy and Newton. That people feel that they know better than God what is in God's interest. That's a dangerous state to be in. And that has continued down through history. People who are willing even to consign themselves to everlasting punishment, as they see it, in order to serve the purposes of an institution they regard as greater than themselves. An institution that was established to bring humanity to God, but on whose behalf they are prepared to do things that within the limits of their own system of belief would exclude them permanently from God's sight. And that's the fate always of those who believe that the end justifies the means, especially if the end is a sacred one. Now, these are the facts, as I said, that bedevil traditional religion. The view of Newton, the view of Ptolemy, supports all those things. The clockwork universe and the clockmaker God sitting out there at a distance does allow you to retain those beliefs unquestioningly. That you're put here in a neutral testing ground, you're observed by God, your salvation consists in good behavior with a reward at the end. There is no suggestion whatsoever of the growth and the evolution and personal development which the Ram has taught us so insistently is at the heart of why we are here. And it sits really well with the Ptolemaic and Newtonian view of the world. The God Jehovah and all that goes with it fits eminently well with this picture too. So that was where we stood until we came to the question of the quantum world. Now, the title of my talk was The Quantum Age, the Ultimate Challenge to Religion. But what I wanted to do was to show that people have always used the scientific views of the world to function as a vehicle for what they believe in. And you can see that exactly. That the way that you and I were brought up to believe and the way the vast majority of Christians and others believe today is formed on the view of Newton and Ptolemy's world. Now, if you accept that, which nobody can deny once it's spelled out for them, logically then, if a view of the world in science has replaced that of Newton and Ptolemy, you ought to accept that view of the world today as a better foundation for what you believe and radically alter what it is that you hold sacred as the truth about you and the cosmos and your destiny in it. And there were two factors, of course, that produced that worldview, as you know. First of all, that is the two theories of Einstein in special and general relativity. And as you know, he was just named Man of the Century by Time magazine. I wonder, is that a positive or a negative thing? Anyway, it's a fact anyway. But it's nearly a century now since Einstein sent the first missile against the classic view of Newton, which had served humanity so well for over 4 centuries. And Einstein's theory of special relativity said that space and time are not two separate realities at all. And if it's true at such a fundamental level as space and time, then it would appear that things can never be understood in isolation from each other, but only in terms of relationship. And there you have the foundational proof of what this school is always teaching, that the absolutely intimate relationship in which all things stand to each other, your God and others, and indeed the whole universe as well. So in one fell swoop, with the theory of relativity, the clockwork God was brought crashing down. So relativity theory was the first penetrating new insight into the nature of how things are, which poses immense challenges for the theological or philosophical understanding of the world, and particularly for the understandings of the world that religions have. Because reality is not a neat, tidy, orderly system of wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S, reacting with each other, which is the basis of all religious belief, as I've just described. Instead, reality is a 4-dimensional space-time continuum. And the famous formula E equals mc squared tells us that matter is fundamentally a form of energy which can be endlessly mutated and transformed. Now, the common sense view of reality which we gain through our senses every day pales beside the vistas that open up once you start to dabble in the world of relativity. In fact, it's suggested that space and time are actually mental constructs, that they are categories we've imposed on what we see. They're not absolutes that we happen to notice. We create them. That, as you see, is absolutely supportive of the teachings of the Ram. But that wasn't all. There was more to come, because in the 1920s, the scientists began to push the frontiers of imagination in this field even farther, with the perception of an alive universe in which everything was interrelated. The stage was set then for the arrival of quantum theory, which showed how outdated was the classical distinction between the wave, which is the momentum, and the particle, which is the position, and also speaks of a wave packet in which electrons are neither fully one state or another. And Newton's model was made completely obsolete at that level, the mini level, by another discovery, that at the subatomic level, matter does not exist with certainty in any fixed location at all, but only shows a tendency to exist. That's the potentials that are waiting to be activated, as we've heard so often. And according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, it's not possible to determine with absolute precision both the position and the momentum of any given subatomic particle. It's not possible. So reality is indeterminate at a fundamental level, and you have no security of a fixed vantage point. In other words, consciousness and energy create reality. We don't discover it. So the myth of a solid and indestructible matter is vaporized along with the idea that the laws of nature are strictly deterministic. Quantum theory shows the basic oneness of the entire universe. So it's led to a completely new way of viewing matter, but also has profound implications naturally for the study of consciousness. The very act of observation involves an interaction with what's observed, as the tradition of Eastern mysticism had always maintained. The observer and the observed are essentially one. There is no room for a judgmental God scrutinizing and evaluating our behavior from on high. And Professor David Bohm has postulated that all of us lives in what he called the explicate order, the world of manifested appearances. Our perceptions involve a dramatic filtering process because the eye transmits less than 1/1,000,000th part of the information that hits its surface. It transmits less than that to the brain, which the Ram, of course, has said to us time and time again, that we're actually looking at these dimensions, but we have filtered them out. And our evolution, one of the effects of it, is that that filtering is reduced and we begin to see what we see. So the implications of the so-called new physics, it's hardly new now at this stage, is that at a core level in the universe, everything is connected, and that separate and individual identity is an illusion. An individual identity and separateness is at the heart of the way most religions convey their message today. And the so-called reality, material reality that we're so convinced of, represents only one small part of a much larger reality that we can't bring into focus because of the limitation of our physical and mental faculties. So reality at its fundamental level then seems to be vague, changing, fuzzy, hazy, indefinite, probable. Somebody once remarked that this collection of characteristics is very like how you would describe a human relationship. In fact, reality at the quantum level seems precisely to be that. It's a relationship. And our propensity for order, for clarity, for neatness and logic is misplaced in those areas and may instead be seen as a rather unsuccessful attempt to control what cannot be controlled. And that seems to be the bane of religion today. It is trying to control what cannot be controlled. So the heart of the quantum theory then lies in the collapse of the wave function into a particle after an observation has been made. The wave contains many potentials, and the observation brings one of these into being, dependent on the mind of the person observing. And the implications that this has for fundamental religious belief, of course, is earth-shattering. In truth, it's becoming very obvious that the source of all that exists, if you want to use the word God, which is always dangerous, the source of all that exists could not have given us any other commandment than the one the Ram has said so often he gave, to make known the unknown. There was no other commandment possible once you begin to look at the world in the light of quantum theory. And that we truly do live and move and have our being, not here on this earth, but in the heart of that creative source itself. So if, according to quantum theory, the way that we perceive things shapes our reality, and it does it every day because we are creators 100% of the time, then in a universe that's relational above all else, the observer can never be seen as a neutral and objective agent. And what does that say for belief in a strict and judgmental God? There's no place for that sort of being. Everything in the universe would seem to be interconnected, separate and individual. Identity is an absolute illusion. An individual consciousness contains the potentials of all consciousness, universal consciousness. reality is not fixed. It's constructed by our brains in our attempt to make sense of it. So is it any wonder in the realm of physics that if a scientist spends years searching for a fundamental particle which he believes exists, that that particle eventually, obligingly, turns up? Is it any wonder in religious terms, in the realm of consciousness, that the character and the quality of our lives mirror our deepest felt convictions? Is exactly the same. So that is the quantum approach to reality, which you're all very familiar with. And at that stage in South Africa, I gave an outline of the teaching of the Ram. And obviously I'm not going to try to do what has already been so well done in 11,000 hours here. But in summary, to say that at the end of that presentation of Ramtha's view of things, that we came from point zero, that our true self is our God, or point zero, which is a better word, because it doesn't have any of the garbage attaching to the word God that, whether we like it or not, we carry in the hard wiring of the brain. And that our journey is to traverse these 7 levels and bring back the wisdom of that experience. Having given that outline, I said that when we look on the world through the eyes of quantum theory and relativity today, there is only one worldview that corresponded completely with those insights, and that was the teaching of the Ram. And indeed, that the teaching of the Ram transcended and went beyond the findings of science in those 2 areas many, many times as well. So my technique, if you wish, in South Africa was to show that the things that we believe in religion have always been dramatically colored by the pictures of the world that were accepted at the time. If that were so in the past with Ptolemy and Newton, why is it that when the quantum view of the world has shown such an entirely different state of affairs to be the nature of reality, how is it that we won't move with those insights? Because that's what we've already done always in the past. And in other words, we have a dignity that is very hard to express adequately. That our true reality is our God. And the God on the journey is called the Spirit, journeying through the 7 planes with the 7 bodies as a sort of modem to interact with those planes. We have a greatness that's not possible to express. And I quoted President Nelson Mandela on this matter. He referred to it in his inauguration speech in 1994, which must have been one of the shortest inauguration speeches ever. He said, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. We were born to manifest the glory of God that is within us," unquote. 28 years in a quarry and in solitary confinement brings you face to face with a lot of reality. But unfortunately, down through the years, in this process of the journey of the Spirit, through the 7 levels, what's happened to it, a sanctimonious cloak has been thrown over the whole process. And instead of it being seen as the journey of the Spirit through the 7 kingdoms and returning with the wisdom of that process, instead our salvation, as it's so inaccurately called, has been largely seen as placating a moody God, or staying on good terms with Jesus Christ, in the hope that they will give us access to this kingdom after death. In other words, it's obedience plus reward instead of the journey, wisdom, and evolution. So when you look at it in those terms, you see that not alone are the religions off the mark, but they are catastrophically in error about why we are here and what we should do to achieve where we're going. Catastrophically in error, and that is what people are sensing, who may have never heard of any of these ideas. They know in their heart and soul that the religions are providing no answer. They're not hostile, they're just drifting away, as the examples from Europe, I think, show so undeniably. I gave an example. I said, suppose the journey of salvation or redemption, or whatever you want to call it, could be represented as a long and difficult journey, say from Johannesburg to Cape Town, which is about 1,000 miles. And imagine that situation years ago when facilities were very primitive. We're born maybe in Johannesburg. We never realized we were born in order to accomplish this journey. We spend all our time messing around Johannesburg, engrossed in the affairs of that area. Suppose we come there again in our next life, and then get some idea that perhaps there is a journey involved here, which I never realized. We set out, lose our direction, we head north instead of south, we get tired, get confused, and we give up. Or suppose in our next life someone comes along and tells us that the reason we came to Johannesburg was actually to placate a supreme being up in the sky, and that if we keep his rules and behave ourselves, we'll be rewarded at the end by our destiny, which is being put in Cape Town. Unfortunately, of course, we were never told that making the journey personally is what constitutes this evolution. No one can do it for us, not even that God high up in the sky. And that's what religion, unfortunately, is doing. Eventually, at some point in our series of lives, we may realize that the journey is why we're here and set out to achieve it with varying degrees of success, and eventually do make it and become enriched with wisdom and the skills and understanding. Because the path of salvation is about the journey of the soul through the 7 levels. And unless that's accomplished in our religious tradition, we've made no progress on the task for which we came here. Obviously, that's a hard saying to a conference on world religions. But it's a true statement. And religions who conceal that fact from their followers, of course, have a lot to answer for. There are a lot of fundamental categories of religion that have to be reconsidered when we look at it in the light of the quantum age. There's no point in claiming that the realm of faith is different from the realm of reality in general, of science, for instance. It's not. They both come from the same source. And the only difference between them is that a sanctimonious cloak has been thrown over reality in the religious area. To claim that you have a divine authority or mandate which would exempt you from the rules of the nature of reality that the quantum theory shows would be like claiming that you had a divine mandate to say that north was south, or that up was down, or that 2 + 2 = 5. Can't do that. No divine mandate can contradict facts. And obviously, making such a claim reveals far more about the people making the claim than they do about anything else. We have to reconsider all the fundamental categories of religion. In Cape Town, I selected 20 of those major consequences that form the basis of all religions, not just Christianity and the Western religions, but of all religions, East and West. And basically, when you look at those consequences, you see that the fundamentals of all religion have been taken away, and that there is really no justification for continuing in existence while these things are not remedied. The first, of course, is that God can never be seen as separate and distinct from the creation out there, the clockmaker God, but instead that the divine has to be seen as a consciousness that has a creative energy which will include but also surpass everything which traditional teaching ascribes to God. Indeed, the very notion of God and the divine have to be used with great care, because they may inhibit our understanding of what lies at the source and origin of life and its meaning. As I said here a few months ago, I would wish that there were never such a word as God, because, as the Ram touched on this quite a lot last night here, because when we think of God and say we are God, what are we thinking of? We're thinking of the God of Newton's universe. And when you say, I am God, you're thinking along those same lines. Because the God within is not accomplished by taking indoors the God from outside. And that's exactly what we think we're doing. We're not accomplishing the God within by taking the outside God indoors. And that is exactly what we do here, myself included. Number two, the mystery of life is open-ended. No system, obviously from the quantum view of things now, can provide a complete description of reality. And any religious tradition that claims possession of a set of truths that express the nature of reality in an absolute and full way, whether they're doctrinal or moral truths, is out of touch with the way things are. There's nobody attacking them, simply pointing out that they're out of touch with reality. The third point is a primary step in our move back towards our source, replete with wisdom, is that we must overcome polarity. As you remember, time and time again, when we drew the diagrams here of involution and evolution, that at the division between the third and the fourth level, we split into positive and negative, male and female, black and white, and all those other polarities. If the process of our evolution consists in retracing that step while gathering the wisdom, it's obvious from the quantum view of things that the first step is to overcome polarity, because it only belongs at the first three seals level. Most religion teaches the direct opposite of that, because what it preaches so strongly is that you must fight against evil and injustice and hatred. And of course, when you fight in that way, you only empower what it is you oppose. And that is a fundamental error in the attitudes of religion, that they inculcate polarity rather than overcome it. The fourth is that we live in a world now which we know is created by thought. So it's by focusing or concentrating that we advance. Reality is what we shall decide it is and what it shall be. And every person, as I said, whoever lived, does this 100% of the time. In our school, we don't come here to acquire new powers to manifest. We're already manifesting 100% of every day since we were born. What we learn in this school is to change the character of what it is we're manifesting, because it's usually victimization and limitation and so forth, all attitudes of restriction. So there is no royal road to enlightenment, as the Ram has said. We have to discern what it is as we progress. And the observation of any moral code, such as religion teaches, or any code of belief, a doctrinal code, that will not do this job for us. It cannot do the job for us. The attitude is everything in a thought-based world. And when I was saying to you earlier about how the public level of Jesus' teaching here could be perfectly observed with a miserable attitude, that's very true. You can observe those superficially, while filled with resentment and hatred and so forth. But when you go to the deeper levels, you see, of course, that we are in a thought-based world, and the character of what we manifest depends exactly on our thoughts. Created reality consists of 7 levels of existence, is the next point that we have got to focus on in the quantum world. Admittedly, the 7 levels of reality is not contained in quantum teaching, at least as yet, but it is open to that interpretation. And there is a body of scientists right at the moment who suspect that things did not begin at the Big Bang, which would be this point of separation here, but that there's a lot and much more behind that point, and they're now working on that particular level. So science is now moving into the 4th level in terms of its investigations. So what we are springs directly from God and comes beyond and above any of these levels. The next point is that we did not descend into this world contaminated by sin, which all the Christian religions maintained. What we did come is we bore the burdens of lessons that we had so far failed to own as we came into this world, and which consequently hold back our spiritual growth. But that is a very, very different state of affairs from saying we come contaminated by sin, or from saying, as some of the Eastern religions say, that our life and its character now is either a reward or a punishment for how we lived before. That's false. All persons are created equal in dignity in terms of their existence in the quantum view. So there's no basis in the quantum view of reality for any distinction on the basis of color or gender or race or creed or none. Number 8, there is absolutely no place, and this has to be emphasized in a radical way, for the subjugation of one gender to another. Women and men are different, but they're fundamentally equal. There's no vindication at all possible, obviously, in the quantum view of things, for excluding women from positions of leadership and responsibility in religious structures, or indeed in any other structures in the world. And those who would claim the authority of Jesus Christ for that position would do well to closely examine the degree to which they have warped his message. Number 9, there's no place in this view of things for a universe where God is a separate and passive power, but God instead is a direct relational presence. That means, it sounds very nice and abstract, like Copernicus and Kepler before Galileo came along. That means, in practice, that there is no place for a priesthood that would attempt to insinuate itself as an intermediary between the individual and his and her God. And there is no place for a religion that would insinuate itself as an intermediary. Does that mean that there's no place for religion? By no means. But the type of religion is crucial here. There's every room for a priesthood and for a church along the lines of what a word in my own language, the Irish language, conveys. The word is anam chara. It means a friend of the soul, or a spokesman for the soul, which is what the Ram says he is in our regard. He is our soul spokesman. There's every room for that function in religion, but that is a far cry indeed from the way religions exercise their function today. Number 10, the color, the race, the creed, or the other situation in which we find ourselves were chosen by the Spirit in the light of the history of the soul. And the purpose of these choices were to confront us with the lessons we need to learn in order to advance spiritually. That's eminently harmonious with the quantum understanding of the world. We're here to gain a personal growth by gaining wisdom on each plane, and it's obvious that nobody can do that for us. It's inescapably personal. Nobody can do it any more than anyone could be born for us, grow up for us, or eat our meals for us. And those who place their hopes in a personal savior, in this substitution sense, are greatly misled. Because embracing Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior does nothing for your personal evolution if left on its own? What's the it that Jesus is supposed to do for you? 12th point, nobody can redeem us because there's nothing to be redeemed from. We are certainly spiritually enfeebled. As we all know, when you're sitting in your tent in the Blue College, you sometimes feel that very painfully. But that is not due to a fall from grace on the part of Adam and Eve in paradise. And neither will our regeneration be accomplished by embracing a personal Savior. Nobody brought us where we are except ourselves, and nobody is going to take us out of where we are except yours truly. Jesus is an ideal of a wonderful kind and an extraordinary help for us, but he is not an idol to be glorified and worshipped, though that is exactly the way in which religions present him. Our life is not a period of testing, but an opportunity to own what it is we experience. And that's how we advance spiritually, by engaging life responsibly. We own something, not when we give it up. We have owned something when it gives us up. That's the knack. A major step is to realize there's only myself in my life. That's absolutely at the heart of the quantum view, that the observer creates reality. There's only myself in my life, and every person and circumstance in my life. In the quantum view of the world, I must concede that I brought it there. And that, as the Ram said, is the depths of the dark night of the soul. One should realize that. Because there's nobody to point the finger at, which is such a delicious pastime. It's one of the great joys of the fallen state, is to point the finger at all the people who have caused me to be in my present deprived condition. But as well as being the depths of the dark night of the soul, it's also the first day of your liberation. Because that's when you have started to move. Once you accept, as the quantum world view teaches, that I create my own reality. Because now at long last I have turned around and have unmasked my necromancer. Now I have identified my assassin. And it's a very familiar face. And that's why the process in this school, or in a quantum view of the world, is so different from the so-called New Age. Because the New Age is as far from reality as religion of the old kind is. The only difference is it's on the other extreme. Because all too often what happens is we just give our power away to some guru or avatar, or hop from one to another, merely exchanging a novel and temporarily more exotic form of enslavement for the one we left behind. You've been told that endlessly from this very podium. 15, what we put out to others returns to ourselves infallibly. That's the quantum law of creation. And Jesus, in his sort of public level teaching, said, do unto others what you would wish done unto you. He didn't teach that just to be nice, or because to be a wonderful thing to do. He taught it because that's the way reality is. Whatever you put out bounds back to you first. That's why you can't heal anybody else until you're able to heal yourself first, etc., etc. So the command of Jesus to practice universal love was based on a very practical understanding of how reality works. We hate in others only what we hate in ourselves, but can't bear to see in ourselves. until it's mirrored back to us by somebody else. And that gives a very, very different understanding to the sort of public, superficial Christian versions of the public teaching of Jesus. The normal and unenlightened reaction when those things are seen is resentment. It takes a truly powerful and disinterested commitment to see matter for what it really is. The 17th point was that when we pray, we must follow the advice of Jesus to the letter. When you pray for something, he said, imagine it's already yours, and it will be so. That's another way of putting what we've been taught so often here, that when you pray, you must be what you wish to manifest. But instead, when we pray, we're usually asking or begging God, or our God as we have it now, or some angel or some saint, say in religion, to give us something. And by definition, our mentality is, when we pray that way, that we do not have what we are praying for. I pray for fabulous wealth. I make a card for fabulous wealth. What do I end up doing in my focus? I imagine how wonderful it would be if I had this fabulous wealth. How marvelous it would be. What's that mean? It means I don't have it. So all you're manifesting is how marvelous it would be. What we're trying to manifest is, it is. This is why we go into all these emotions in focus. I think I'm getting off the point here. But anyway, we're really in our focus, I'm convinced, most of the time. All we're doing is an exercise in separation, because we're imagining what A, B, or C, or D would be like if we had it or were it. And instead, as the Ram has emphasized a million times here, we must be it first, not desire it or imagine what it would be like if we did have it. In other words, our prayers are never answered or not answered. And this is a big problem for Christians, I know in particular. In the quantum world, you must realize that prayers are never answered or not answered. Instead, the fact is that whatever our deepest mentality happens to be when we pray, always manifests. Always. But the mentality that we have is very often, sadly, at variance with the words that we utter in our prayer. Of course, we pray in one frame of mind, and then for the rest of the day, we lapse back into the old frame of mind. 23 hours in lack, 1 hour in abundance. No prizes for guessing the result. Number 19, the world will not have an end, and life is ultimately geared to the triumph of goodness and must eventually return to the source from whence it came. Life is not destroyed in the ultimate catastrophe predicted by the second law of thermodynamics. That's another concept of the quantum world that needs to be absorbed. And now that the threat of Y2K seems to have come and gone, we'll have to find some other Armageddon to dread. Human beings are innately spiritual. That's our deepest nature in the bosom of God. And so it is with all life forms. And if spiritual maturity takes place, human beings will feel a need to celebrate that in ritual, to celebrate their bond with the ultimate source of all that we live. We must have a universal love. And so on. I mean, you can go through all of these realities, and when you try to look at them through the spectacles of the quantum view, you will find that 99% of what is retailed in any religion, practically, is off the mark, and sometimes really seriously. Now, the title of my talk, as I said earlier, was The Quantum Age. the ultimate challenge for religion. It was the Ram who picked that title. And when you realize what the implications of the quantum view of things are, you are confronted with the inescapable fact that religions are in a hopeless situation given the character of what they retail and the spirit in which it is retailed. Now the problem is, can we learn the lessons of history, like the Lutheran Catholic agreement? Are we going to be able to learn the lessons of history even if we can't turn back the pages of history? That is the lesson. In other words, are we going to once again let our minds be so closed that we affirm with certitude things about which we have yet no evidence to support? I want to give a small example to close of that. I came across last year or so a report about an observatory which the Vatican has a major share in at Mount Graham in Arizona. The observatory is staffed by Jesuit astronomers. Now, according to this report which I saw, which was in the Times, the London Times, last year, in 1998, one of the problems that they're studying there is whether, if alien races exist, whether the redemption brought by the passion and resurrection of Jesus extends to them. Presumably, this is the it that we're talking about, which Jesus will do for you. This is the it. Anyway, that's one of the points. And this was in the, as I say, the Times is a very respectable paper, as you know. But it's reminiscent of the debates of the Spanish theologians in the 16th century when the Spanish ships first reached the New World. Because all of the people who lived over here, they didn't see how they could have descended from Adam and Eve, because there was too much water in between where Adam and Eve lived and these people. So it's difficult to see how they could be descended from Adam and Eve. Therefore, they couldn't be human. They didn't have a soul, and therefore you can rob and steal them blind with impunity. There's always a political motive behind theological beliefs. So, if the Indians couldn't have human souls, well, presumably these aliens might need to be saved, whatever this is. But anyway, to finish the quotation, this is serious. I am not making this up. According to the deputy director of this observatory, which was quoted in another newspaper, the Sunday Times, on the 14th of December, if civilization were to be found on other planets, he said, and if it were feasible to communicate, then we would want to send missionaries to save them. Now, I'm very heartened at your reaction, because when I said this in Cape Town, there wasn't a murmur. Well, that's why it's good to be back. I think what that statement reveals is that there are some levels of arrogance so breathless and profound and so unaware that you really can't make any response to them. How can supposedly highly educated people still live in the universe of Ptolemy? That's what it is. I said at the end that a great document is supposed to be produced from this Parliament of World Religions, and I said, is it too much to hope that it might address some of these fundamental issues. Only some of which, by the way, I've listed, because I only had an hour and a half. Of course, they won't address any of these issues. But if they did, they might usher in a new dawn for the religions so that they could lead us to our God instead of placing themselves between our God and ourselves, which can't be done anyway. Or would it be found too difficult, like when you throw a lifeline to a drowning man, he doesn't want to put it on because it might be undignified. Now, I said that there was not one religion represented at that conference that hasn't seriously gone astray with at least some of the issues that I listed. And that's a fact of history. What's done is done. The test is, what are you willing to do about it now to rectify the situation? A chap called Stephen Holler said, mimicking the old Western movies, he said, you ever hear that movie, How the West Was Won? The Holler has a book called How the West Was Lost, religiously. He said the West was lost religiously because of an unwarranted outward turn of consciousness. He said it can only be regained by a re-establishment of balance attendant upon a reclamation of inward realities. And I said what I offered here, I said to the Ram before going out that I was a bit nervous speaking to this group, because normally when you speak to an audience, you hope maybe that you might please 50% or 60%, or on a good day, maybe a few more. But that I was going to offend everybody because I was basically saying that there's no place at all for religions, any religion, as they're practiced today. And that's hardly the way, as Dale Carnegie used to say, to win friends and influence people. He said, bang away anyway. But I was not trying to be an iconoclast against religions. I said what I was offering was offered in concern and love, in the hope that religions might become closer to what they ought to be, which should be to all our advantage. And I said maybe there's also a touch of what Albert Einstein once described, that I had reached the blessed age when if someone tells me I have to wear socks, I no longer have to. And I said that I freely admitted with some sadness that the witness of history was against that hope manifesting for the religions, but hope always springs eternal. But as I said, if religions do not set about these matters, it's equally obvious they're living on borrowed time because they can't survive. It's unlikely they'll totally disappear, but they'll certainly be reduced to shadows of their former selves. So that's where we stand. I concluded with some remarks about how you might like to see your understanding of God, because that shapes all other beliefs. That God is not haughty, distant, and remote, but closer to us than we are to ourselves. Nor has anyone ever to say to your God, as religion teaches they should, that he is great, because your God rests in a state that needs no affirmation. And that's the sure guarantee. There can never be a threat to what your God is, because he is not moody and despotic. Your God is your greatest glory, closer to you than you are to yourself. And it's not the old man in the sky with the beard, so beloved of Isaac Newton. That's why you shouldn't use the word God at all. And I said at the end that Judgment Day had arrived for the churches. I was on safer ground at this stage because the people that were walking out had already gone. So the prospect of an umbrella between the eyes was diminishing. So Judgment Day has definitely arrived for the churches. I mean, the statistics from Europe show that. This catastrophic decline is fairly recent and fairly unstoppable, I think. That's not something we should be happy about, really. But however, it's a fact. And the reason is that any religious group that intrudes itself between God and the individual is doomed, because people will feel that in their hearts and souls. So I said to them, will I shed tears at the church's requiem? I said, I'll shed copious tears, because at first hand I know how the churches have provided solace, support, and inspiration, as well as a path to the divine for countless millions of people for whom it otherwise might always have remained hidden. But I said my tears will be far less for the demise of the churches and the religions, because that demise, after all, will have been self-inflicted. Much more will it be for the travesty that will have been made of the teachings of Yeshua ben Joseph, a teaching which stands head and shoulders above the walls of the labyrinth within which limited religions have tried to contain it. So my tears, I said, will be far more for the glory and the liberation that might have been brought forth for so many millions, but never was. And I closed with two statements of Jesus, which I said were apt for what I've said to you today. The first, I have come to cast fire upon the earth. I would that it were already enkindled. That's an aspect of Jesus that's often forgotten. And secondly, that this day, truth has been spoken in your midst. He or she who has ears to hear, let them hear. Thank you.